Picture this. It's a crisp Tuesday morning in January 1986. Millions of Americans, school children, teachers, parents, office workers are gathered around television sets across the country. They're not watching a sporting event or a presidential address. They're watching 7 human beings prepare to ride a controlled explosion into the heavens. The mood is electric, optimistic, almost celebratory. And then, 73 seconds after liftoff, the sky turns white. What most people remember about the Challenger disaster is the image, that terrible branching plume of smoke splitting across a blue Florida sky. What most people don't know is nearly everything else. The warnings that were buried, the engineers who begged NASA to wait, the political forces quietly pushing the launch forward, and perhaps most haunting of all, the possibility that the crew didn't die when the world thought they did. Once you understand what really happened, not just the explosion itself, but the years of decisions that made it inevitable, the story of Challenger stops being a tragedy about technology and becomes something far more disturbing, a story about human beings choosing comfort over truth and the devastating price that follows. To understand why Challenger failed, you have to go back to the moment the Space Shuttle program was conceived, because trouble didn't begin on the launch pad. It began in the budget meetings of the early 1970s. After the Apollo program successfully landed men on the moon, NASA found itself in a paradoxical position. It had accomplished one of humanity's greatest feats, and yet public enthusiasm was cooling and congressional funding was shrinking. The agency desperately needed a new vision, something that could justify its existence and its budget. The answer they arrived at was the Space Shuttle, a reusable spacecraft that could launch like a rocket, orbit like a spacecraft, and land like an airplane. The pitch was compelling. Instead of throwing away an expensive rocket with every mission, NASA would fly the same vehicle dozens of times a year, making space access routine, affordable, and commercially viable. The problem was that the budget NASA received to build this machine was nowhere near what the program actually required. Engineers had to make compromises, serious ones. The most consequential of these involve the solid rocket boosters, the enormous cylindrical engines strapped to the sides of the shuttle's orange external fuel tank. The original, safer design called for liquid-fueled boosters, which could be throttled and even shut down in an emergency. But liquid-fueled boosters were expensive and complex. Under budget pressure, NASA selected solid rocket boosters instead, manufactured by a Utah-based contractor called Morton Thiokol. Solid rockets are cheaper and simpler to build, but they carry a fundamental danger. Once ignited, they cannot be turned off. There is no abort, no pause. From the moment the fuse is lit, the crew is committed to wherever that rocket takes them. To make matters worse, the boosters were built in segments rather than as a single seamless unit, largely because they needed to be transported across the country by rail. These segments were bolted together on the launch pad and sealed with rubber rings, O-rings, designed to expand under heat and prevent superheated gases from escaping the joint. It was a clever engineering solution on paper. In practice, it introduced a vulnerability that engineers would spend the next several years desperately trying to get someone to take seriously. By 1984, 2 years before Challenger's final flight, Roger Boisjoly was alarmed. A senior engineer at Morton Thiokol, Boisjoly had been analyzing post-flight data from the shuttle's earlier missions, and what he found kept him up at night. The O-rings weren't sealing reliably. On multiple flights, engineers found evidence of soot and erosion on the rings, proof that hot gases had been leaking past the primary seal, with only the secondary backup ring preventing disaster. On one mission, the primary O-ring had failed entirely. Boisjoly wrote an internal memo that was remarkable in its clarity and urgency. He warned that the O-ring problem, if left unaddressed, could result in a catastrophic failure and the loss of human life. He proposed design changes. He requested cold weather testing. He asked for a third O-ring to be added as an additional safety measure. Each request was denied or deferred. Too expensive. Too time-consuming. The next launch was already scheduled. What makes this even more troubling is that Boisjoly's warnings weren't falling on ignorant ears. NASA's own engineers and managers understood the O-ring erosion problem. They had documented it, categorized it, and discussed it in internal meetings. But through a gradual, insidious process that sociologist Diane Vaughan would later call the normalization of deviance, the repeated presence of O-ring damage without a catastrophic result had caused managers to reclassify the problem. It wasn't a crisis anymore, it was a known and acceptable anomaly. The reasoning, though it defied common sense, was disturbingly straightforward. The O-rings had eroded on previous flights, and those flights had returned safely. Therefore, erosion was survivable. Therefore, the next flight would probably be fine too. This is one of the most chilling psychological phenomena in the entire story. It wasn't ignorance that doomed Challenger. It was familiarity. On the evening of January 27, 1986, the night before the scheduled launch, engineers at Morton Thiokol held an urgent teleconference with NASA officials. The weather forecast for the following morning was deeply concerning. Temperatures at Kennedy Space Center were expected to drop well below freezing overnight, far colder than anything the shuttle had ever launched in before. Boisjoli and his colleagues brought everything they had: charts, erosion data, temperature correlations, mathematical projections. Their argument was straightforward. O-rings become less flexible in cold temperatures. If they stiffen and fail to expand properly during ignition, hot gases will escape. The colder it is, the greater the danger. They were recommending a delay until temperatures rose to a safer level. Initially, Thiokol management sided with their engineers, but NASA's response was a form of pressure so subtle yet so powerful that it changed the outcome of history. Officials pushed back. They questioned the data. They asked, perhaps the most dangerous question ever asked in aerospace history, for proof that the cold would cause a failure, rather than proof that it was safe to launch. It was an inversion of the fundamental principle of safety engineering. The burden of proof had been quietly shifted from prove it's safe to prove it's dangerous. And in a room where careers and contracts and institutional relationships were all implicitly on the line, the engineers couldn't produce the kind of airtight certainty NASA was demanding. When a brief recess was called so that Thiokol managers could deliberate privately, one senior manager told Boisjoli and the other engineers to, essentially, take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. The recommendation to delay was reversed. NASA was told the launch could proceed. Boisjoli, devastated, signed off on a decision he believed was wrong. That night, he later said he was convinced that people were going to die in the morning. He was right. At 11:38 in the morning on January 28, 1986, Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center. The overnight temperatures had indeed dropped below freezing, and ice had formed on the launch pad structures. 1 second after ignition, just 1 single second, cameras captured a puff of dark gray smoke near the lower joint of the right solid rocket booster. It was barely visible, easy to miss, but that smoke was the first sign that the cold O-rings had failed to seal. By extraordinary coincidence, a small piece of debris temporarily plugged the gap, allowing the shuttle to keep climbing. For about 60 seconds, Challenger flew on pure luck. The crew was calm. Telemetry data was flowing normally. The families watching from the viewing stands were smiling. Commander Dick Scobby's voice came through the radio, steady and professional. Everything looked fine. At 64 seconds, the debris plug failed. The flame that had been contained burst through the joint and angled toward the external fuel tank. Within seconds, it was burning through the aluminum skin of a tank holding hundreds of thousands of gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, the most volatile combination of propellants in the world. The structure began to fail from the inside. At 73 seconds, it was over. The external tank ruptured. The volatile propellants mixed and released an enormous burst of energy. The shuttle's airframe, traveling at nearly 2,000 miles per hour, could not survive the resulting aerodynamic forces. The orbiter broke apart. The iconic Y-shaped cloud that appeared in the Florida sky was not, technically, an explosion in the traditional sense. It was structural disintegration, a machine tearing itself apart because the forces holding it together had been overwhelmed. The world watched in silence, then in horror as the two solid rocket boosters, still burning, now uncontrolled, carved erratic white lines across the sky before range safety officers triggered their self-destruct systems and ended their trajectories. Here is the detail that changes everything, the part that most school textbooks skip, that NASA took years to acknowledge publicly, and that makes the Challenger disaster not just a tragedy, but something far harder to process. The crew did not die when the shuttle broke apart. The forward crew compartment, the section of the orbiter where the 7 astronauts were seated, was structurally reinforced and remained largely intact as the rest of the vehicle disintegrated around it. While the wings, engines, and fuselage were torn away by the aerodynamic forces, the crew cabin was flung upward and outward, continuing to rise briefly before beginning a 2.5-minute descent toward the Atlantic Ocean from an altitude of roughly 65,000 feet. Investigators discovered that 3 of the 7 personal egress air packs, small emergency oxygen devices worn by crew members, had been manually activated after the breakup. These devices are not automated. They cannot be switched on by the shock of an explosion or by any mechanical process. A human hand had to reach for them, locate the switch, and turn them on. Someone on that crew, in the seconds after the shuttle tore apart, was conscious, aware, and responding. Beyond the air packs, cockpit switch positions were found to have changed from their standard launch configuration. These were switches in positions only reachable by a seated crew member unaffected by the forces of the breakup. Investigators believe pilot Mike Smith may have been attempting to restore power or take some form of action during the fall. The descent lasted approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The crew had no parachutes. The shuttle was never designed with an emergency crew escape system that could function in those circumstances. There was no power, no radio contact, no guidance. Just 7 people falling toward the ocean in a sealed compartment in the dark with no way out. The cabin struck the ocean surface at an estimated 207 miles per hour. The force of impact was unsurvivable. Whether any of the crew remained conscious throughout the descent or lost awareness due to cabin depressurization and hypoxia remains a question NASA has never definitively answered. The agency initially withheld these findings, releasing them only under sustained pressure from journalists and congressional investigators. In the aftermath of Challenger, the Rogers Commission, a presidential investigative panel that included physicist Richard Feynman, produced a scathing report. It confirmed what engineers like Boisjoly had been saying for years. The O-ring design was flawed. The cold weather risk was documented and ignored. The internal culture at NASA had become one where schedule and public image consistently overrode safety concerns. Feynman, in his characteristic bluntness, demonstrated the O-ring problem during a live televised hearing by simply dropping a piece of rubber ring into a glass of ice water and showing it lose its flexibility. He concluded that NASA's estimates of acceptable risk were dangerously optimistic, detached from engineering reality, and shaped by institutional desire to keep flying. Boisjoly was vindicated, but at tremendous personal cost. After speaking honestly to the Rogers Commission and contradicting his employer's account of the pre-launch teleconference, he faced professional retaliation and was effectively isolated within Morton Thiokol. He eventually left the company and spent the remainder of his career speaking publicly about engineering ethics, whistleblowing, and the institutional pressures that silence people who try to tell the truth. He died in 2012. The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. Redesigned O-rings with improved cold weather performance were implemented. Escape systems were added for certain emergency scenarios. And yet, in 2003, 17 years later, the Columbia disaster demonstrated that NASA's underlying cultural problems had not been fully resolved. Different mechanism, different failure, same disease. Warning signs minimized, safety compromises accepted, institutional pressure overriding engineering judgment. In 2022, a dive team working on an entirely unrelated documentary off the coast of Florida made a startling accidental discovery. A 20-foot section of the Challenger orbiter preserved on the ocean floor, thermal tiles still attached to the fuselage. It had been sitting there for 36 years, unseen, unmapped, undisturbed. The find was a reminder that the physical remnants of the disaster, like its deeper lessons, haven't been fully recovered yet. Challenger was not a story about a rubber seal. It was a story about what happens when institutions stop listening to the people who understand their own systems best. It was about the quiet violence of dismissing expertise, of treating inconvenient warnings as disloyalty, of allowing the pressure of deadlines and public relations to override the cold, unsexy, unglamorous demands of engineering safety. 7 people flew into the sky that January morning trusting that the system around them had done its job. The system had not. And in those final 2.5 minutes, falling through the cold air above the Atlantic in silence and darkness, they paid for a failure that was never really about a rubber ring at all.